Just 16 years ago, the New Haven Board of Alders created the New Haven Port Authority. But that doesn't mean that Long Wharf hasn't been a bustling port for over 400 years. Our guest today on Municipal Voice is Judy Scheffel, the Executive Director of the Port Authority, to tell us a little bit more about what role the New Haven Port plays in Connecticut. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me.
It's good to be here. We're overlooking
I love the view.
the port right from our offices here at CCM, so it's very appropriate. So always the best place to start is at the beginning. For our listeners at home, what is the Port Authority?
Well, what the Port Authority is, it's a quasi-governmental agency which
Okay.
was established by the Board of Alders, as you had mentioned,
New Haven,
back
yeah.
New Haven, back in, actually the legislation I think was passed in 2003.
Mhm.
And it was basically created to assist in the increase of waterborne freight
Okay.
through the Port of New Haven. There were also a couple of things that were going on at the state level at that time that kind of prompted the creation of the Port Authority. The then governor had created a Transportation Strategy Board.
Okay. Who was that?
It was Roland.
It was Roland. Okay.
And he was actually looking at projects that could help improve the air quality along the I-95 corridor. And so the Transportation Strategy Board had put out a request from the various port authorities in the state to try to see if they could mount a feeder barge system with the Port of New York, New Jersey,
Okay.
which would actually take some of the trucks off the highways and move them
Reduce
onto a
their.
barge.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So actually, at the time, I was actually working in economic development for the city of New Haven. We did not have a port authority, and
Just didn't exist.
it didn't exist. And when we wanted to try to see if we could create one, the first obstacle was that in the state enabling legislation, it only provided for the cities of Bridgeport and New London to be able to create port authorities. So that was the first
That's
action.
interesting. Why did it?
No one knows what the history is
Like
there.
why those two? Huh.
But we did
Interesting.
actually, with the assistance of Senator Looney, was able to get the legislation changed that would then enable New Haven to create a port authority, which I think happened in probably not until 2002. Meanwhile, it was 2000 that we were putting together this application for a feeder barge system, which ultimately the grant money from the Transportation Strategy Board did go to Bridgeport, but they were never able to actually mount a system. And a lot of the reasons for that were that it was basically going to be one-way traffic being product from New York, and there was no return
So
cargo.
you need something going both ways to
You
make
do.
it work out, or else you
You
have
do.
empty
Well, it's very
ships
costly.
going the other.
Absolutely,
So it needs to be making money going both
Right.
ways.
And the other thing, the cost of double handling containers.
What's double handling?
Well, you'd have to handle it. The union of workers down at the Port of New York, New Jersey would have to offload it. It'd have to be loaded onto these barges and then offloaded again.
Here.
In the Port of
So basically, we had to get offloaded twice, and that was the sticking.
Right.
Interesting.
And the other thing that is curious, I mean, I actually always thought that the environmental benefits from this would attract the end users who were to look at this as an alternative, but they were really more interested in knowing where their cargo was at all times and being able to get it to the door, because even when it, as quickly as possible, because even when it was offloaded in a Connecticut port, it would then require, a truck to transport it to its facility. So although it never went anywhere at that time, there has been recent discussion that its time may come again, especially with the larger container vessels that are coming to the East Coast with the completion of the new canal, in the Panama Canal, which is
Will allow bigger ships to come through?
ships.
Okay.
So there may be an opportunity to revisit that whole container on barge system to one of the
Okay.
one of the
Because
ports.
how do the bigger ones affect
Only
that?
because the amount of containers that are suspected to come into the port at any one time, just the movement of those containers out of the gate could create
So
such
just the sheer
congestion.
volume of
Just the sheer
containers
volume.
coming in might require more
Other
ports.
options for actually delivering. those containers.
That's really cool.
Right now, New Haven has no containerized cargo.
Okay.
Our
So what does come in right now? Yeah.
Our major cargo is liquid cargo. I mean, in 2010, we were one of the 5 largest handlers of liquid cargo in the entire country, only after places like, Port Everglades, New York.
Yeah.
So there's a large volume.
So liquid cargo, is that oil?
Petroleum, oil,
So that's
oil.
the tanks that people might have seen from '95 when they're
Yes.
going through those big round tanks with the dinosaurs painted on one.
That's right.
Liquid
That's
cargo.
Magellan. And actually, in addition to the storage tanks that you see right in the port itself, there are remote facilities that are fed by pipeline. There's one actually out in East Haven, just behind the CarMax facility.
Interesting.
There's another one in Hamden, along the 91 corridor. There's quite a network.
Are those the pipes that are along, it's very New Haven, over Middletown Avenue going over the river there? There's a bridge with big pipes running alongside it, and that's part of that system, huh? Oh, interesting. Now I know what that does.
Actually, that is a really interesting thing about the Port of New Haven, because not only do we have a lot of waterborne cargo, we actually have, we've had extensive movements in freight rail over the past couple of years since it's been reinstituted to the port, and also the pipeline. That pipeline serves Bradley Airport and Westover Reserve Base.
Really?
And it takes a remarkable number. In fact, I would never remember this, so I actually wrote down some stats. But
we love stats.
It takes the trucks that would go to Bradley are taking weekly 126 trucks off 91.
By this pipeline?
By pipeline.
It goes direct from
the port.
From right here.
Yeah, comes in, the jet fuel comes in either on barge or vessel, and gets stored in those tanks, and then gets transported out through Buckeye Pipeline.
That's wild. I did not know that. Who owns the port?
The port consists of privately owned terminals.
Okay.
There are
So the different terminals have little pieces of waterfront that they
Yes.
own. Okay.
The Port Authority itself owns no water side property. Our standing is based totally on the fact that we own approximately 12 acres of land that we lease to the dry cargo operators for laydown area for their storage, steel, wood product, mostly steel at this point. And that is also our total source of our revenue from those license agreements that we have with the 2 dry cargo.
That's what funds the authority.
Funds the authority. Yes.
That's interesting. So it doesn't come out of taxes. It's not
No.
publicly funded. Okay.
No. It's our entire budget is $150,000 a year, which is not tremendous, but in addition to paying salary, and I'm the only full-time employee.
Okay.
In addition to myself, and I'm not full-time, I'm a part-time employee. But in addition to myself, there is an intern. We try to keep an intern working on a fairly consistent basis, and just your normal insurance, some studies.
Yeah.
So we have to look for funding from outside sources to do larger projects.
So the Port Authority is only 16 years old right now. Was
Yes.
there any other sort of body before that? What's the history of kind of the running of the port before there was an authority?
It was all privately owned. And to be honest with you, the private terminal operators and businesses do quite a good job. But the other thing that was happening at the same time as that Transportation Strategy Board was being created, the state of Connecticut Department of Transportation was embarking upon the Q Bridge project. And the administration at the time felt it would be important to have a port authority that was dedicated to supporting the interests of those terminals who really didn't have, their day-to-day operations consume their time. Interfacing with government agencies really is what the Port Authority does.
So like all the different agencies come together at you, and then you kind of act as a go-between, sort of condensing it down into one for them, and probably the other way around too.
And then they'll come to us if they have permitting issues, so we'll work with certainly the Port Authorities work with the Army Corps of Engineers on this feasibility study to determine whether the channel will be deep in. There have been 2 resounding issues that the terminal operators have talked about since the day we were created, and that one was the depth of our channel, which is currently 35 feet, and the other was the lack of available lay down area for their product close to their terminals.
Okay.
Because the cost of moving it out to a remote location just adds to the shipping cost.
If you got to pick it up and move
Yeah.
it again, yeah.
Right.
It's interesting.
So the other thing I might note is that we are not a regulatory body, and that
You're
was
not a regulatory.
yeah. So that was actually something that we had to impart that to the terminal operators, because initially I think they were a little suspect. Are we just going to be coming in to tell them what to do, how to run their operations? That's not what we do. We're there to help them.
That's great. So right on the website for the New Haven Port Authority, there's a couple of interesting facts about the scale of this port. It's the busiest port between New York and Boston,
Yes.
the largest deep water port in the state of Connecticut, and
Yes.
ranked 53rd by the Army Corps of Engineers by volume.
Yes.
What kind of impact does it have for the area?
Well, the fact that we actually, import just about all of the home heating oil, gasoline, and diesel fuel that's used by the state and even beyond is significant.
For most of the state?
Most of the state,
Okay.
yeah. In addition to that, we pretty much handle probably 90% of the road salt, which is very necessary.
It comes in by
by vessel.
Did
That
not
all
know
comes from usually from South America, the road
Just
salt.
all the way
Yeah.
by ship. That's great.
And in addition to the road salt, we also, actually, one of the terminals imports a chemical salt. And this actually, I think, epitomizes why the Port Authority was created. It brings in this chemical salt, which actually gets delivered out to a chemical processing business right at the Hamden, New Haven line.
Okay, so nearby.
It's stored. It comes in twice a year from Brazil. It has to be stored to be out of the elements. So the Port Authority actually leased the land to one of the terminals. They built a shed to contain it. It comes in twice a year, 2 shipments a year, and gets transported out daily, just 2 truckloads. This facility that could otherwise not actually store the product on their site. And we estimated it took approximately 600 to 700 trucks off 95 coming from the Port of New York.
And is that, what is chemical salt? Is that
Well,
road salt?
it's a chemical salt. No, it's a chemical salt that's then used by the water pollution control agencies to break down the matter that they collect. So,
interesting.
which is right, actually, directly across the street from
Which is right next door to our offices, in between
yes.
this area and that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It is a dense area, and we're here in our office buildings. Looking out here, we can see the Amistad and that kind of stuff. How does the economic, sort of the industrial sort of aspect of that side of the harbor play with some of the more recreational stuff? Because there are big plans that talk about redeveloping Long Wharf into 5-minute districts and that sort of thing. Are you guys involved in that, or is it kind of separate wheelhouses?
No, I definitely think the city made a when they created the Port Authority and also defined the Port District, they intentionally kept it all on the east side, the commercial harbor on the east side of the harbor. In recent months, or I'd say probably in the past year, we have had several discussions with the folks who are running the boathouse, just to make everyone aware of some of the issues that can be created when you have such a busy commercial
that's what I was going
so
to say.
close.
Part of that plan is there's the Amistad sailing vessel out here, but also to have maybe ferries and more recreational vehicles over here.
Yeah, they're actually looking at having both kayaks and paddleboards, and I mean it's just going to be a matter of education. There's certainly other bodies of water.
Yeah, and other ports where there's big ships and the thing, but
it's
that
just
has to be worked out somewhere.
It's making people understand that those large vessels cannot stop on a dime, and the barges that are coming in are usually under the control of the tug that may be on the opposite side of the barge.
So if there's someone in a kayak, they won't even necessarily see them.
They don't want to get too close. I mean, there's plenty of room out here to share the waters, but we just want to make sure that everyone understands.
Is that a matter of like marking sort of the deep channel for the thing and being like kayakers stay over
Well,
here?
the channel is marked, and actually, if the boaters stay, they don't have to stay out of that channel. I mean, I mean, they just
But if
have
they
to
never
be
went in,
cautious.
if they already marching out, if they never went in there, they don't have to worry about
They wouldn't
the
have to
big
worry.
ships.
Right.
So there's enough room for everybody.
But there is enough room. I mean, the other things that play into it and are, also the wind conditions, the tide. You can find yourself, suddenly out in the middle of the harbor and the winds change and the tide change and you're going to be really paddling significantly to get back in.
Or smaller power boats and
Right,
in and out. But that isn't really a
But actually,
problem.
it would be great to see more recreational vessels out here. That's the one thing that always struck me, is that it's one of the few bodies of water driving down 95. When you come upon it, you don't see
a lot of recreation going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of the yacht clubs a little bit up the river, I think they tend to go out and off somewhere else. Really fascinating stuff.
So if I can give a little bit more information
I'd love to.
about those stats, about the
Number of stats.
okay, the stats, ranking 53rd out of the top 150 ports that are run by the Army Corps every year, which is pretty significant. I mean, when you look at the range. I mean, we're only at like...
we don't have a lot of coastline, really, as compared to California. Some of these other states have hundreds and hundreds of miles.
And especially if you look at California, and they have naturally deep water, they don't even need their
dredging is not a problem.
Dredging is not a problem. Not like the East Coast, or especially someplace like New Haven. And actually, for that matter, all of the ports in Connecticut are at the the outflow of rivers. So you have all that sediment that
built
comes
up
down.
Continual.
And the other thing about the sediment, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality, that most of the contaminants, if they're found, when
in the sediment,
is in the sediment, but they're mostly legacy contaminants that have washed down, continue to wash down
from our industrial past, the factories upriver.
Right. It has little to do with the operations of these terminals.
You spoke about dredging and the Army Corps. So there are plans in place to make the channel deeper?
So that's what's happening now, and it's been going on for about 3 years. The Army Corps is undertaking a feasibility study to determine whether the channel should be deepened. It's currently at 35 feet. They actually they had to do a benefit cost analysis at increments of like 2 feet. Started at 37, they went to, then I think they went down to like 30, 38, 39, 40, all the way up to 42 feet to see where that break-even line would come, and it came at 40 feet.
40 feet, which would allow a slightly larger class of ships.
Slightly larger class. Yeah, the next class up of ships.
Like moving up one.
Right.
Just
which is
the mega ones.
Oh, never.
But
yeah,
we're never going to be New York.
No, absolutely not. And
but we can be a lot
not
more
only
than it is now.
not only because of the depth of water, we don't have the landside infrastructure to support those larger vessels. I mean, that's the other thing.
It's already developed all around, so there's not just big chunks of land you can do things on necessarily.
Well, even in terms of the dockside, the berths, I mean, each of the terminals had to pledge, if this project goes forward, that they would undertake any reconstruction of their berths to accommodate the larger vessels that would come in because of this of the deepening.
Did they have if they want to, it's on them, or they're actually saying we will do this? We are saying we're going to build these new things if you do this.
The private terminals would have to build them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. The only thing that will be now, what happens now with the construction? The estimated, the next step after the feasibility study is completed, it actually has to go to Congress. The Senate has to reauthorize the channel depth.
U.S. and not Connecticut.
No.
Okay.
The U.S. Senate has to reauthorize the channel depth. There was a reauthorization back in '81, which actually recommended a 40-foot channel.
This is not new.
But we were never able to get the funding to actually, because there is a cost share. When you're doing a construction project, unlike a maintenance dredge, once the U.S. government defines what the controlling depth of the channel should be,
so you can always get back to that.
They have to come back and dredge to keep it like this 35-foot depth. We're on a rotation of approximately every 8 years for the feds to actually come back.
The Army Corps comes in and does that. Okay.
Yeah. So if we go to 40 feet after the construction is done, where there is a cost share, it's an interesting it's supposed to be 75-25, but then the local sponsor has to come up with another 10. So it's like,
Interesting.
yeah. But actually, I think the local share for this project is estimated to cost about $20 million.
Okay.
And actually, our delegation, our Connecticut delegation, has, in fact, they're going to be looking for a vote on this at the special session next week.
Mm-hmm. So your cost $20 million, have they done any studies on the impact what it could bring in, the improvements?
Oh, yes. They actually had to demonstrate there was a benefit. This is also, I should tell you, a 50-year lookout.
Okay, so looking,
yeah. They're looking out. They don't do these construction projects, for any immediate
for next year.
No,
It's for the future of the port.
See, at this point, we don't even know who's not coming in here because of the debt, because a lot of these shippers will actually look at,
just skip
what
right
they can
over it.
accommodate and just skip right over it. And in some instances, vessels that actually require a deeper draft will come in, but they'll lighter. They'll actually take product off and put it onto a barge outside.
So they'll park a little bit farther out, a smaller boat comes up.
Yep, there's a lighter area just beyond the breakwaters. Yeah. Or they'll do what they call two-porting. They'll go to a larger port first and then come into New Haven. So it definitely, it adds to the transportation cost.
A step, it adds the cost. When was the last time the channel was deepened?
In the 50s, to the 35 feet. And then it was most recently, we had a maintenance dredge in 14-15.
You mentioned before some things about pollution. Is that a concern here with the sediment having metals and old stuff in it?
Well, anything that does have, it all has to be tested. So in order to actually dispose of any dredge material in the open water disposal site outside of New Haven, it would require stringent testing.
Open water disposal site, does that mean
you
get dredge in and
it goes out.
Sound, basically?
It goes out. There's a site. There are actually 3 sites that have been identified in Long Island Sound. This is Central. There's one Western, which is down off Norwalk, and there's the eastern site off of New London, which is now in litigation.
Okay.
EPA had approved that site for disposal. The state of New York has actually sued both EPA and the state of Connecticut Deep to try to get that. That is actually a pending lawsuit.
So you tend to get some pushback from some of the cities that don't want from New York specifically. Just New York.
Just New York, yeah.
Okay. I want to let everyone at home know that you're listening to WNHH LP 103.5 FM, the Municipal Voice. And with us today is our special guest, Judy, from the Port Authority. And we are talking about all the interesting things that are going on right outside our office windows here in the Port of New Haven. So you talked about that you work closely with the private terminal operators supporting business. Can you give us some more examples of how that plays out?
Well, a couple of ways. First of all, there are a lot of, I get calls from companies who are interested in bringing product in, so I kind of act as a clearinghouse. I'll find out what it is there.
So you match them up with the right person on this end that would be able to handle that type of material.
Do that. But also, probably more importantly, if they have any zoning issues or if they're looking for permits for dredging or to install structures, I can work with them and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to try to facilitate that
So
process.
the same way as with the channel and the dredging, if individual operators want to do that, it's a similar process.
Right. Yeah.
How many people work in the port, do you think?
It's interesting because the liquid cargo terminals do not require a lot of manpower because everything is so automated. So they do not add significantly to the employment base at the terminals themselves.
Okay.
But what they do is they have this, independent truckers that actually are hauling the product out.
So like the heating oil stuff, is it supports
heating
the
oil,
entire
gasoline.
state, so all those truckers, all those different companies are coming to the oil provided through the port.
That's correct.
And then it's going out to the state.
Yeah, and there are times could be 600 tanker trucks a day coming into one of those terminals. On the other hand, the dry cargo operators require much more in the way of manpower just from the loading.
So that would be the
vessels.
shipping containers.
Not shipping containers. This is bulk
Okay.
and break bulk, but when it comes off, especially, the only export that we do out of New Haven is scrap. And in fact, that's the only export I think is going out of the state, scrap metal.
Yeah.
And so all of that is stored at the terminal site, but the day that the vessels are usually more than one day that the vessels are at berth to actually have the cargo loaded on. I mean, there's just, trucks, backloaders, everything you can see to get these vessels loaded. And by the same token, when the salt ships come in, they also require that level of ground crew to take the product off, put it on the trucks. It's usually taken to remote locations. There's one on the corner of East and Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see several
the big salt
piles of salt there.
So that's that business over there is related to the port side.
Absolutely.
And connected by the train. So
No, that's actually truck. I mean, there's no efficiency, economic or otherwise, to move.
For a train to go a mile.
Yeah.
It's over the long haul that the trains work out.
Right.
Got it.
Right. So what does come out of the port by rail is rolled steel, mostly product that is overweight to actually take.
It's just too big to put on a truck.
Or too heavy.
Too heavy to put on a truck.
And we also bring product in by rail.
Yeah. How integrated is that? And is there a counterpart to what you do for the rail that you work with?
I work with the rail people.
Okay. You work directly with the rail people.
Right. P&W was the operator. They sold to Geneseo, Wyoming a couple years ago, but they still have the P&W that operates this freight rail line. But we have a biodiesel manufacturing facility in the port, and they bring in all of their byproduct that they use from the Midwest or Cargill, and it comes in by rail.
So with products like that coming in, there's the huge machinery in Long Wharf. We're talking about over on this side, people wanting to do recreation. Is there a concern about the air quality or some of these materials being handled?
Air quality has been addressed in recent years. I think it was 2012, the U.S. actually enforced regulations that all vessels coming in had to use an ultra low sulfur fuel.
So
it's really improved the air quality. And actually, I think it's in and that's all vessels in U.S. waters, not just in the port. And I think I think this coming January 2020, the International Maritime Association is going to enforce even stricter regulations on the amount of sulfur in the fuel for ocean, just regular ocean.
So smokestacks in the middle of the thing come out pouring smoke. That's not what's going on.
Well, if you see it, call me.
If you see it, call you and let the authority know.
Yeah. But air quality is certainly
a
it's
concern.
always been
You got to
concern.
think about it.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out before, some of the impetus behind this project originally was because of the air quality on the road that this is more efficient.
Right. And in fact, a lot of I will get calls from time to time that people think they're actually, they're smelling diesel fumes, but it has more to do with the intersection of the junction of 91 and 95, especially if you have a lot of traffic, because idling trucks and vehicles actually emit much more carbon monoxide than if they're just running.
Speaking of vessels stuff, tugboats.
Yes.
We see them. We watch them from our windows here all day. They play a big part. And recently there was an article on Slate talking about what an actually difficult job that is.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the tugboats and how they work in the port?
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff?
I think so. I actually listened to some of that Slate broadcast. One of the distinctions I'd like to draw is that we do not have docking pilots here. They're usually larger ports that have containerized vessels. Okay. What we do have are sea pilots that have to meet any vessels, not barges, but any vessels that are coming into the port a pilot has to go out. There's actually a point out in Long Island Sound, not far from the race when you come into the Sound there, that the pilots actually have to board the vessel.
And guide them.
Actually steer them in. The captain always has the option of taking the helm, but in most cases, because the pilots are much more familiar with these waters,
so they just kind of hand it over.
They hand it over to the pilot. The pilots do use the tugs as they get like closer to the berth, and they direct them as to, depending on the tide, the wind conditions, as to where to come alongside their vessel. But those pilots do have to actually, I've seen videos of them having to climb in all kinds of terrible weather conditions, climb up those rope ladders on the side of the vessels.
Wow.
Yes.
That's a pretty crazy job.
Yeah.
Who do they actually work for?
The pilots?
The pilots and the tugs. Like, who does that fall under?
Okay, so the pilots is there's actually, the pilots all have to be licensed by the state of Connecticut or whatever body of water they want to work in.
Okay.
In the case of New Haven, we have pilots from New York and Connecticut that actually are licensed to work in this harbor. The actual tugs, Gateway Terminal has a fleet of tugs, but there are also tugs that come up from New York.
So they're privately owned?
Privately owned, all privately
By the
owned.
terminals, all the tugs?
Right. Well, not all the terminals, just some, like Gateway is the only terminal here that owns their own tugs. We also have a facility just a little way up, just north of the Ferry Street Bridge, former Buchanan Marine. They actually, their parent company is Norfolk Tug out of Virginia, but they actually build and repair barges, ocean-going barges up there.
So the companies coming in with the ships companies that run tugboats, and it's just part of the business, not part of the Port Authorities.
Oh, no. In fact, it's the shipping agent. If we want to get into
the shipping agent, there's a lot of titles here.
The shipping agents who actually marry all of those parties. They actually they work with the shippers that want to bring their product in. They will sometimes find the vessel, because a lot of these vessels are just chartered vessels that they can actually contract with. They also work with the terminal operators because they know what the facilities can handle. And then any other, anything else that's required, be it a tug or if a vessel, if it's a tanker, it needs to be boomed. In Connecticut, we have restrictions that all tankers that are at berth and they're offloading product have to have a boom around it's to control any spills.
Oh, so in the things in the water that go around it as they're unloading, they don't want oil or anything else getting into the harbor itself.
So all of those accommodations are made and provided for. The other interesting thing is that there also has to be a provision for any of the crew that may want to leave the vessel while it's at berth, because all of these are secure terminals that have security plans that are filed with the Coast Guard that have to be strictly adhered to. So there needs to be an escort. Anyone that doesn't have a transportation worker identification credential, the TWIC card.
Because some of these are coming from South America.
So they would need to be escorted by someone with a TWIC card off the premises outside of the secure area. So
show them the town or whatever.
Well, just drop them off.
Just drop them off.
They go to Walmart. That's where they usually
want to go. They want to go to Walmart. Yeah, you've been on sea for a while and pick up some basics, I guess.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of things. What do you think people in Connecticut, our listeners, should know about the port? What is the takeaway?
Well, it's always pretty striking to me how few people know that we have these major ports in Connecticut.
That all the oil is coming in here. It's the sheer volume of what's going on.
Right. I don't think they connect the fact that their homes are being warmed in the winter by fuel that's coming from.
Do you think most people just fly past on the Q Bridge at 65 or more miles an hour and don't think about it much?
I don't. I absolutely don't. And part of my job has been to try to talk to people about it in schools and wherever people will listen to me. So.
And what do you think, for the people, what's the most single amazing thing about it? Just blows their mind. Is it the sheer volume that's going through?
I think it's what connects us. It connects us to a bigger world.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I haven't heard of these folks in a while, but there was a professor at Southern who used to bring his geography class down to meet with me in the summer, and it was striking how little people understood about the interconnectivity of the global market. I mean,
our offices are right here. I look at it every day.
Yes.
And so many of the things you've talked about, I have no idea that there's all these different jobs and responsibilities and the way stuff is divided. It's absolutely fascinating.
it is fascinating. And I mean, there are many more jobs than just the people who work on the docks. I mean, there's, especially after 9/11, the whole port security industry.
So that stepped up after 9/11
Absolutely
drastically.
stepped in it. There's a business here that just when tankers come in, they go in and they test the product to make sure it's what it's supposed to be and that the volumes are correct. There are companies that clean the tanks.
So there's all the associated little smaller companies doing all these things.
Right. Plus, as I mentioned, the shipping agents, the freight forwarders, the administrative logistics people.
There's
who
a
are out
lot
there.
built around this, and this could all be growing.
I think the other piece of this, which people have to understand, is how dynamic Connecticut is in the whole role of shipping logistics. Stamford has an incredible number of businesses that are actually just dealing with, finance, building, just.
So there's a
whole
maritime
industry. Yes.
in Connecticut.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, down the farther, say, the electric boat and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a continuation of what's been going on in New Haven. Harbor
Well, since
the start.
colonial time.
That's why New Haven's here, because there was a harbor.
Absolutely.
This is amazing stuff. We might have to have you back to talk about this again in the future as things unfold.
Okay, well, I have to do it soon because I'm retiring in December.
Oh, all right. Well, we'll have to get on it quick then. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer. Christopher Gilson is our producer. Harry Grubbs on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like. And watch out for our CCM Chat series on our YouTube page. Just search for CCM Chats and you'll find them in one convenient place.
felt as though I needed to explore other voices. And so at that point, in starting the second draft, I introduced a number of other voices, including Johnny's and Eliza's. And, I think that the world is more dimensional for that, for sure. And while I still see Jude as a sort of central character,
Jesse, you'll find them in one convenient place. Being here, we're overlooking
I love the view.
the port right from our offices here at CCM, so it's very appropriate. So always the best place to start is at the beginning. For our listeners at home,
which would actually take some of the trucks off the highways and move them
reduce
onto a
their.
large.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So actually, at the time I was actually working in economic development for the city of New Haven. Mm-hmm. We did not have a port authority, and
it didn't exist.
It didn't exist.
Interesting. Why did it?
No one knows what the history is.
Like
there.
why those two? Huh?
But we did actually, with the assistance of Senator Looney, was able to get the legislation changed that would then enable New Haven to create a port authority, which I think happened in probably not until 2002. Meanwhile, it was 2000 that we were putting together this application.
The Port Authority.
Well, what the Port Authority is, it's a quasi-governmental agency which was established by the Board of Alders, as you had mentioned, New Haven, back in, actually the legislation I think was passed in 2003. Mm-hmm. And it was basically created to
always the best place to start is at the beginning.
It's a quasi-governmental agency which was established by...
Give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments below.
Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me.
It's good to be here. We're overlooking
I love the view.
the offices here at CCM, so it's very appropriate. So always the best place to start is at the beginning. For our listeners at home, what is the Port Authority?
Well, what the Port Authority is, it's a quasi-governmental agency which was established by the Board of Alders, as you had mentioned, New Haven, back in, actually the legislation I think was passed in 2003. And it was basically created to assist...
And so it's a continued Port Authority.
Well, what the Port Authority is, it's a quasi-governmental agency which was established by the Board of Alders, as you had mentioned, back in New Haven. People understand that those large vessels cannot stop on a dime, and the barges that are coming in are usually under the control of the tug that may be on the opposite side of the barge. Under the control of the tug that may be on the opposite side of the barge.
So if there's someone in a kayak, they won't even necessarily see them.
They don't want to get too close. I mean, there's plenty of room out here to show the waters, but we just want to make sure that everyone understands.
Is that a matter of like marking sort of the deep channel for the thing and being like kayakers stay over
Well,
years?
the channel is marked. And actually, if the boaters stay, they don't have to stay out of that channel.
But if they never went in, if they already marked out, they never went in there, they don't have to worry about the big ships.
Right.
So there's enough room for everybody.
But there is enough room. I mean, the other things that play into it and are,
Like marking someone in a kayak, they won't even necessarily see them.
They don't want to get too close. I mean, there's plenty of room out here to show the waters, but we just want to make sure that everyone understands.
Is that a matter of like marking sort of the deep channel for the thing and being like kayakers stay over? But if they never went in, if they very much worry about the big ships.
Right.
So
the time you can find yourself, suddenly out in the middle of the harbor and the winds change and the tide change and you're going to be really paddling significantly to get back in. That always struck me is that it's one of the few bodies of water driving down 95, when you come upon it, you don't see
A lot of
recreation.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of yak clubs a little bit uprooted, and they tend to go out and off somewhere else.
Right.
Really fascinating stuff.
So when you look at the range, I mean, we're it's not a problem. Not like the East Coast, or especially someplace like New Haven, and actually, for that matter, all of the ports in Connecticut are at the the outflow of rivers.
Yeah.
So you have all that sediment that
builds
goes
up
down.
continual.
And the other thing about the sediment, which is unfortunate, but it's the reality, that most of the contaminants, if they're found, when
In the sediment.
is in the sediment, but they're mostly legacy contaminants that have washed down, continue to wash down
From the-
from the taking a feasibility study to determine whether the channel should be deepened. It's currently at 35 feet. They had to do a benefit cost analysis at increments of like 2 feet. Started at 37, they went to, then I think they went down to like 30, 38, 39, 40, all the way up to 42 feet to see where that break-even line would come, and it came at 40 feet.
40 feet, which would allow us slightly lower.
Larger vessels. I mean, that's the other thing. The growth. I mean, each of the terminals had to pledge, if this project goes forward, that they would undertake any reconstruction of their berths to accommodate the larger vessels that would come in because of this of the deepening.
Would they have it? If they want to, it's on them, or they're actually saying, we will do this, we are saying we're going to build these new things if you do this.
The private terminals would have to build them. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, the only thing that will be, now what happens now with the construction, we estimated, the next step after the feasibility study is completed, it actually has to go to Congress. The Senate has to reauthorize the channel depth.
You have not.
Which channel?
This is not new.
We were not able to get the funding to actually, because there is a cost share. When you're doing a construction project, unlike a maintenance dredge, once the U.S. government defines what the controlling depth of the channel should be, 8 years for the feds to actually come back. So, after the construction is done, where there is a cost share, it's an interesting. It's supposed to be 75-25, but then the local sponsor has to come up with another 10. So it's like, but actually, I think the local share for this project is estimated to cost about $20 million.
Okay.
And actually, our delegation, our Connecticut delegation, has, in fact, they're going to be looking for a vote on this at the special session next week.
I think your cost $20 million. Have they done any studies on the impact what it could bring in the improvements?
Oh, yes. They actually had to demonstrate there was a benefit. This is also, I should tell you, a 50-year lookout.
Okay, so looking, yeah.
They're looking out. They don't do these construction projects, for any immediate. And in some instances, vessels that actually require a deeper draft will come in, but they'll lighter. They'll actually take product off and put it onto a barge out of the sky. We'll go to the larger port first, and then come into New Haven. So it definitely it adds to the. When it was most recently, we had a maintenance dredge in 14-15.
Is that a concern? It's having metals and old stuff in it?
Well, so in order to actually dispose of any dredge material in the open water disposal site outside of New Haven, it would require stringent testing.
Open water disposal site, does that mean?
There's one western, which is down off Norwalk, and there's the eastern site off of New London, which is now in litigation.
Okay.
EPA had approved that site for disposal. The state of New York has actually sued both EPA and the state of Connecticut deep to try to get that. That is actually a pending lawsuit.
So you tend to get some pushback?
From companies who are interested in bringing product in, so I kind of act as a clearinghouse. I'll find out what it is there.
So you have
If they have any zoning issues or if they're looking for permits for dredging or to install structures, I can work with them and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to try to facilitate that. The liquid cargo terminals do not require a lot of manpower because everything is so automated. So they do not add significantly to the employment base at the terminals themselves.
Okay.
But what they do is they have independent truckers that actually are hauling the product out.
So the heating oil stuff, is it?
Uh, 600 tanker trucks a day coming into one of those terminals. On the other hand, the dry cargo operators require much more in the way of manpower just from the loading. In fact, that's the only export I think is going out of the state of scrap metal.
Yeah.
And so all of that is stored at the terminal site, but the day that the vessels are usually more than one day that the vessels are at berth to actually have the cargo loaded on. I mean, there's just, trucks, backloaders, everything you can see to get these vessels loaded. And by the same token, when the salt ships come in, they also require that level of ground crew to take the product off, put it on the trucks. It's usually taken to remote locations. There's one on the corner of East and Chapel. Mm-hmm. You'll see several.
Just too
heavy.
Too heavy for a truck.
And we also bring product in by rail.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, they still have the POW that operates this freight rail line. But we have a biodiesel manufacturing facility in the port, and they bring in all of their byproduct that they use from the Midwest, from Cargill, and it comes in by rail.
So with product, we're talking about quality of these materials being handled.
Now, air quality has been addressed in recent years. I think it was 2012, the U.S. actually enforced regulations that all vessels coming in had to use an ultra-low sulfur fuel.
So
and it's really improved the air quality. And actually, I think it's in and that's all vessels in U.S. waters, not just in the port. And I think it's I think this coming January 2020, the International Maritime Association is going to force even stricter regulations on the amount of sulfur in the fuel for ocean, just regular ocean stuff.
such an front. It was almost like it seemed that he felt a personal hurt, and then that was translated towards deep anger, towards towards that entire car for letting that happen. It felt like it was the channeling of so much of their just energy around wanting to truly believe in, be committed to something, and be able to sustain some pattern of behavior. I think the book, in some way, reading this, I felt that there was some respect for their endeavor, and that it had just gone too far.
I saw also, I'd agree there's a way in which they just desire to believe in something. I think it's also a lot about the need for control in a life that feels really out of control. It reminded me in a lot of ways of anorexia, of this sense that like by abstaining, you have control over something and you can feel this kind of sense of purity because of self-denial. And it was that same sense of something having gone a bit too far. And then I also felt like it was both a means of exerting control over your own life, but also a means of protecting themselves from being hurt. Because especially with Johnny, there's a moment where he talks about, he wants to renounce all desires. And when you renounce all desires, it brings peace. And I think that he feels that if he has no desire, he cannot be hurt. It's by wanting connection, by wanting love, that opens you up to pain. And that's in Johnny's life in so many ways. He has this brother and he loses him, and his mother abandons him, and his father, whom he thinks he has found, uses him and steals his money, and then goes to jail. And even his sexuality is a place of fear for him. I think both because just in general, what it means to be gay in the mid 80s is where it was not as accepted as it might be today, is scary. And then also because it's the beginning of this era of AIDS, and so it seems like indulging in his desires is certain death. And so abstaining is a form of self-protection.
Yeah, I thought that straight edge for Johnny, it was also a form of his own control over the other kids. But I actually thought that for Jude, it saved his life. I mean, he was, just wasting away as a high school student, just getting high and kind of being completely lost in New York and not having any guidance, anything to hold on to. And straight edge sort of rescued him. And his overreaction, I thought, well, he's an adolescent. Sort of all the possible ways that he could have gone off the deep end, that was not, it had that positive side. So in that sense, probably better than Wheatgrass.
I wondered about his the role of parents or just adults as either models or, in a way, cautionary tales, because it felt to me like the parents in Vermont were behaving in very similar ways to the adult figure in New York, Les, who it almost felt like the change in perspective for Jude, and to complete the analogy, Jude had a relationship with his mother that wasn't, it didn't seem necessarily like he was following her behavior, although her, deep connection to drugs and involvement with drugs probably enabled him in a certain sense. But Les, being a similar user, became this sort of, I feel, a disgusting or undesirable figure for Jude once he was in New York. And I was wondering what sort of caused that shift, because it clearly had an impact on him, but it wasn't a totally different character from the one who'd been his nearest, so-called supervisor in Vermont.
Well, I think that, I think that it's really Teddy's death that is the change. And I think that, when Jude first moves to New York, he he doesn't feel that kind of repulsion for Les. He likes living with him, and in fact, Les tries to have fewer rules than his mom, and doesn't make him go to school, and doesn't make him have a curfew, and basically says, "I know you're going to smoke, and that's fine, but just don't get arrested because you bring the cops into my house, and they're going to see my greenhouse with my pot plants, and I don't want to get arrested." And I think in the beginning, Jude enjoys that. But ultimately, I mean, you always, it's kind of a cliche, right? Like kids want boundaries, kids want rules, that you're doing it for them. But in this book, I think the book really endorses that Jude ultimately is looking for someone to make his life feel less out of control. And when he encounters Johnny, and Johnny gives him this sort of ready-made set of strictures, he is drawn to that. And again, it's not immediate, right? Like for a while, knowing Johnny, he sort of is interested, but thinks it's kind of ridiculous. And it's only after he has this experience where he goes to Johnny's concert and he is tripping on shrooms, and he ultimately puts his hand in a plate of candles and gets burned and has this kind of, epiphany or experience transforms him in that way, that he then, goes in the complete opposite direction. But, Jude is a very addictive personality. So it's like one or the other. Either he's going to be all in as far as the drugs go, or he's all in as far as the renunciation of that goes, and everything goes along with that. So there is no middle ground for him. And I think, we see that in that moment where he's driving in the caravan and he sees them smoking a cigarette, and it's this, moment of deep transgression. Like there is no, okay, one cigarette, like no big deal. And same thing with his father. It's like, all or nothing.
He doesn't exactly have a model for moderation.
Very true. But what's interesting is that I don't, even though in some ways he condemns Les, he continues to call upon him. He continues to look to him in a fatherly role. As Eleanor Henderson mentioned in our interview, there's that time when Eliza is bleeding and they think she might be losing the baby. And who do they call? They call him. And partly they call him because they think he's not so much of a grown-up and they can trust him to keep their secret and he's not going to tell Eliza's mom. But partly I think he calls him because who do you call when you're 16 and you don't know what to do? You call your dad. And that's kind of heartbreaking, is that, in all the ways the parents fail the kids, they still want them. There's that moment when Eliza is talking to Harriet, Jude's mother, and she kind of collapses in on her and she says, "I want my mom." And I thought that was so...
Yeah, it wasn't because her mom was such a great mom, but you do kind of need a mom.
And there's another moment where Jude goes to talk to Rooster, and he notices that that Rooster has this Band-Aid on his forehead, and he says, he felt a small spring of sympathy for him. Did he have no mother to tend to his wounds? And you think, did Jude really have a mother who tended to his wounds? But he feels that he does, because what you've got is what you've got, and you still feel the need.
Right,
for
there's a
that.
presence there. She's there. He lived with her.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I wonder what you think of the parents in this book, and whether they are all kind of equally culpable and equally bad role models, or if there is some differentiation between them, and if there's more forgiveness or kindness to one than the other.
I felt like I feel like the book doesn't judge them, and you're not. Well, the mother of Johnny and Teddy, who abandons them and just she's a drunk and an exploiter. But I think Harriet and Les, Jude's parents, I thought it was a pretty sympathetic portrait on a certain level. I mean, Les is okay. He's, he knows how to lead. Like, Johnny says at a certain moment, he would turn any opportunity into an opportunity for leave taking. But still, there are tender moments with him. And there are a lot of tender moments with Harriet, with his mother. I mean, I think she comes off pretty well. And the moment when she worries that Jude had fetal alcohol syndrome, And there's this sort of, I somehow I couldn't find the particular quote, but she says, maybe she can share the guilt with another mother or something. And you just, I think it's a very sympathetic portrait of her. And then she gets rewarded in the end and gets a nice PI to share her life with.
I was happy that she found Bob.
Me too.
He seemed like a nice guy.
Me too. I thought, we're supposed to like her. We want her to be rewarded.
Well, the PI brings up the parent we haven't mentioned. We haven't talked about Eliza hardly at all in this conversation. I think she merits a lot of, discussion and breakdown. But her mother is a really interesting figure who is at once enmeshed in all of these other relationships, having been connected with Les, but at the same time it leads a very, she lives she lives uptown. There is a literal remove that she has from all of this, and I feel like the book actually uses that to make her seem even more like the other in a negative way. Like at least they can call Les. At least when they're going to the hospital, they'll give Les a call and bring him around. Like they are just completely the kids at least completely reject Eliza's mother, and I think that in some sense there may be a feeling that actually she is in some ways the most parental, right? She's the most she is the most controlling. Well, there's parental controlling, but a little younger. But so there's perhaps a judgment there, but I in terms of effectiveness as a parent, she doesn't come really close, because effectiveness feels like it's about presence, and there's some connection, there's some sense of being in touch with your children, and she and Eliza are incredibly distant.
Except at the end. Except towards the end when Eliza then decides she doesn't want to keep the baby, and then her mother, really is there to take care of her, and you'll go on. And I read this book on Kindle, and the fun thing about reading it on Kindle is you get to see popular highlights. So
what did the people like?
Okay, I'm going to tell you. The most popular highlight was something that Di thinks about being a parent.
Oh, I think I know what it's going to be.
It's that one, What on Earth is a Rightful Mother? Which she is with Harriet. She's gone to Harriet looking for her children, as they, for both of their children. They've gone off. What on earth is a rightful mother? Were they rightful mothers? In Di's mind, there was no such thing. No parent ever acted in her child's best interest. No parent was a hero. A parent wrote her child's story every day. The story was what the parent left behind. Teenage pregnancy had not been in Di's script for Eliza. Di had the power to revise this scene. She could excuse Eliza from her own bleak future. And then 34 highlighters for the next sentence. Mm-hmm. She didn't want her daughter to be trapped in telling someone else's story before she had a chance to tell her own.
Make it 35, because I wrote it down too.
Because it's the mother who gets trapped in telling someone else's story. So I thought that was a sort of fairly, pretty poignant that. But meanwhile, it was the one like this. And there were other kind of tough things about parents that get said along the way, which I don't necessarily think that's where Henderson ends up in her feeling about these parents. But
for me, Diane was the hardest character to understand. I think we get the least of her, and what we get is a little contradictory.
Yeah.
In some ways, she's supposed to be your Upper East Side parent.
Yeah.
She's kind of wealthy, and she has this career. She's been a ballerina, and she lives in this nice apartment. She has a maid, and she sends Eliza away to school, private school, and that didn't really square with her relationship with Les to me,
right?
Which is long-standing, and we never got enough of her to understand what the connection there was, and so I felt, I felt confused by her. It felt like that relationship was almost there to connect them, but wasn't fully realized for me. So I have a harder time making sense of her behaviors. But I really did love that moment. because for me it is a very forgiving moment for
Yeah.
her. It's again
Yeah.
what Eleanor
Yeah,
Henderson said in the interview about all these people, including parents, who keep making wrong choices but are motivated by the good intentions that they love
Yes.
their children,
Yes.
and they want to and they want them to be happy, and they don't always know how to do that. And there's a moment where Harriet's talking. She says, look at what happened when you tried too hard to dictate your children's choices. They ended up running even farther from you. So they're always struggling with that. How much do we try to hold on to them? I mean, Harriet literally locks Jude in, right? She padlocks his
Right.
window.
The fire escape.
Right. And then she sends the key to Les in New York, and Les tells Jude it's because she was afraid she would unlock you and let you out.
You're tuned to Jazz Haven at 103.5 FM WNHH, broadcasting from studios in downtown New Haven, streaming at newhavenindependent.org. We're Stan the Man, and on this program, as this is the year of the woman, we'll be bringing the music of some of the great women of jazz, then and now.
Right now, let's please welcome one of the most wonderful bands we know in the world, Sherry Miracle and the Diva Jazz Orchestra. Sherry Miracle and the Diva Jazz Orchestra.
Thank you very much. And we do indeed love being here with you. And so does Janelle Reichman on the tenor saxophone. Thank you. And that was Jamie Dauber playing the trumpet.